right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for your patience as we work through all the hybrid logistical details that we have to work through. I'm hopeful that everyone can hear me okay on Zoom. Hopefully not if you're not able to hear, if maybe you could put in the chat and just kind of let us know how that's going. But welcome everyone to our first Alberti Center Colloquia for the 2023-2024 school year. We're very excited and honored to have Dr. Rachel Garth presenting for us today on victimization experiences among transgender and gender expansive adolescents, an examination of prevalence, impact, and protective factors. So Dr. Garth is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She also directs the Violence Prevention Research Lab. Dr. Garth obtained her PhD in developmental psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University and completed a postdoctoral position at the Chicago Center for Youth Violence Prevention at the University of Chicago, Crown Family School Social Work Policy and Practice. Dr. Garth's research examines the etiology, consequences, and prevention of youth violence. In particular, she examines factors that promote healthy youth development among individuals who have been historically marginalized, including racial and ethnic minority youth and gender minority youth. Through this research, she focuses on guiding violence prevention efforts. She has led and contributed to numerous research projects examining the development, implementation, and evaluation of school, family, and community-based violence prevention programs. Dr. Garth is also the principal investigator on statewide violence prevention planning grant, which directly informs state funding, policies, and programs. Side note, Dr. Garth was also the recipient of the Alberti Center's Early Career Award in 2022. So we're very excited to have her here. Before we get into her presentation, just a couple of notes. So for those of you that are attending on Zoom, again, I'm hoping you're able to hear me okay right now. But please stay muted throughout the presentation. If you accidentally unmute yourself, we may go ahead and mute you, because sometimes you don't notice when you're not muted. And then we'll have, Dr. Garth has about a 45 to 60 minute presentation planned. So we'll have time at the end for questions. So for those of you on Zoom, if you could please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll monitor those throughout and they'll be addressed at the end as time allows. And then any other logistical questions can be put in the chat. And again, we'll monitor those throughout the presentation. At the end, we'll send a link and a QR code for the evaluation feedback. And this is also how you will receive your certificate of attendance. So I think that's it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Garth. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I teach freshman statistics. I don't usually get a good morning back. Really nice. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to come and talk to you about my research. This has been a couple of years of labor of love that we've been working as a team to really try to understand victimization experiences among trans and gender expansive youth in Illinois. So I'm excited to share with you some of the work that we've done and also talk about next steps that we have planned, thinking from a prevention lens of how we can influence schools and policies in Illinois and hopefully beyond Illinois as well. So today's talk, before I jump into it, which I look like we've already kind of covered is about me, but if you're at all interested in some of the larger statewide policy work that I've been working with the state of Illinois, I did include the link to our violence prevention plan if you want to read more about some of the efforts. And a huge part of that is trying to make sure that we're amplifying the voices of trans and gender expansive youth in that state policy. So again, we want to make sure that that thread is really clear as the state is planning to think about how to better protect their youth in schools. So today I figured I'd be talking about some of the things that we all know, but again, there hasn't been a ton of research to really expand this out so that when we go to policy and legislators really have the numbers and to really give evidence for what we're trying to articulate. So we know that LGBTQ plus youth are at disproportionate risk for experiencing violence and mental health concerns. But significantly less research has kind of pulled out the T of LGBTQ plus. And often gender expansive adolescents are also missing from that research. So we had this stream of research studies that really tried to address that gap and really centering the experiences of these adolescents. Some of the objectives that I'll be talking through today is
showing you some of the results that looked at the prevalence and impact of victimization experiences among transgender expansive youth. We did a study that looked at the protective role of school climate, and again, giving us some ideas of ways to talk to schools about the ways that they can bolster their services and supports for students. And then really thinking about the ways in which we can integrate these findings into the world of prevention science. So thinking about the programs and policies, again, at the school level as well as at the policy level. And all of this is to really think about ways in which schools can be more inclusive and supportive to gender diverse students. Again, these are not always a safe and caring environment for trans and gender expansive youth. So again, how can we help give voice to this research so that we can try and make a difference? So behind this work, I think everyone in this room is similar kind of goals and what they are researching. We approach victimization from a public health concern perspective. We know that there are significant disparities and many youth experience bullying at school. So in Illinois, these data showed us that 1 in 3 students report experiencing bullying. 1 in 5 students experience bullying online or through social media or through texting. And about 14% of adolescents who have started dating are experiencing a form of dating violence. And so again, victimization is a public health concern, especially as we see links between victimization and negative mental health outcomes. So while we know this, that victimization is a prevalent concern, significantly less research has looked at victimization specifically within LGBTQ+ youth. Though we have, with our research, shown that they experience higher levels of bullying, discrimination, and other forms of violence when they are at school and in their communities. We also see that link with negative mental health outcomes and health outcomes. Again, when thinking about what is increasing that risk for victimization, we're thinking about things like the stigma and stress associated with experiencing gender or sexual discrimination, and really thinking about how those impact their overall victimization trajectory. So before I jump into our research, I wanted to give some key terminology of different terms I'll be using in today's presentation. So when we're thinking about LGBTQ+ umbrella, always want to tease apart sexual and gender identity. So sexual identity is focusing on one's sexual, emotional, or romantic attraction towards other individuals, whereas gender identity is an individual's psychological internal sense of gender that they may or may not express through physical appearance and behaviors. We use the term cisgender to represent individuals whose gender identity is congruent with the gender typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. Whereas transgender individuals' identity or expression is not congruent with the traits culturally associated with sex assigned at birth. And then we're using the term gender expansive to identify individuals who do not identify as male, female, or transgender. They may not identify on the purported binary, they may not identify with a specific gender, or may experience fluidity. So this may include gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender queer. So we use gender expansive as an umbrella to capture those identities. Have we all seen the gender unicorn? Yes. Okay, so again, I always find this really helpful when thinking about within the umbrella of LGBTQ, really thinking about aspects around sexual identity, with gender identity, and again, making sure that as we're using these terms, we're making sure that we're representing these things in a way that is meaningful. All right, last definition before I jump into the research is just so we're on the same footing for the definition for bullying. Again, repeated unwanted aggressive behaviors that can take on multiple forms from peers with a perceived or observed power imbalance. I always foundation this definition though, because if we're looking specifically at LGBTQ+ youth, that power imbalance looks a little bit different. So they're experiencing even higher risks for threats, taunts, and physical and other forms of victimization. And oftentimes that victimization is directly linked to their sexual identity, their gender identity, or their gender expression. So again, they're using this power imbalance to further marginalize and try to harm individuals who identify within the LGBTQ+ umbrella. So for example, they may experience unique forms of bullying. Oftentimes kids will try to out them to other kids or to their families or to school staff. And again, just using different tactics as a way to really disrupt that power imbalance. So again, as we're thinking about these bullying experiences, they may look different specifically for LGBTQ+ youth. Like I said, there's been a surge of research in this area, though there's still some limitations. The majority of work to date is still grouped LGBTQ+ youth together. And very small samples of trans youth are often included in these studies. So usually it's about 1%. So most studies have anywhere from like 10 to 15 students that are trans that are included in this research. So again, we're not hearing a lot from trans youth. Or they just focus on sexual minority youth. They often forget the T or include the T, but don't actually include many trans youth. So again, some limitations there. And then if we think of gender expansive youth, again, who don't really fit into transgender category, they're beyond a different binary. Again, they're only included in a handful of studies. And so they're often left out of victimization research. So to date, we haven't really learned a lot about their experiences at school. So this led to a series of 3 papers that we've published over the last couple of years that really try to address these limitations in the research. We used some statewide data that I'll talk about the methods of a little bit that really tried to pull out the experiences of trans and gender expansive adolescents. The nice thing is because we had a state survey, we were able to hear from over 2,000 trans and gender expansive youth across the state of Illinois to again illustrate what these victimization experiences look like. So in our first study, we looked at the different forms of victimization. So we looked at both peer victimization and dating violence victimization and tried to understand the prevalence across these forms of victimization by gender identity. So again, using larger samples to help us get some important numbers about prevalence. We were also able to do a matching analysis, which gave us comparable groups of male, female, trans, and gender expansive identifying youth. So we were able to use matching analysis to get 1,116 youth per gender identity group. And we were really excited because we were finally able to add an option of how we asked about gender on the Illinois Youth Survey that allowed for us to be inclusive of gender expansive youth who, again, previously maybe felt like there wasn't a checkbox for them to have on a survey, but they didn't even feel like their identity was listed. So it was a really big moment for Illinois to have this on the survey and to have youth feel that they could answer how they identify. In addition to understanding overall prevalence, we also then were able to look at prevalence across middle school and high school. So we wanted to look to see what victimization looked like from 8th grade through 12th grade. Again, we often see with other gender identities, especially with male and female students, we tend to see a kind of a decline across middle to high school as they get towards 12th grade. No research had really looked to see specifically for trans and gender expansive youth to see, did they see that similar decline or do they still have significantly higher rates of victimization throughout their high school experience? And then the third study that built from this research was to then kind of start looking at connections between gender identity and suicidal ideation and other mental health outcomes. I'm sure in New York, it's similar to Illinois. We often see this link between any minoritized identity and an increased risk for suicidal ideation. And so through this research, we really wanted to understand some of those mechanisms that increase that vulnerability towards mental health conditions. So we looked at things like depressive symptoms, victimization, and substance use. We felt like this was an important next step. Again, if we're able to understand what these research connections look like, again, we're able to then talk to schools about ways in which they can prevent suicidal ideation and really support the mental health of all of their students. All right, so across these 3 studies, our methods was from the Illinois Youth Survey, which is a cross-sectional survey. It is administered every other year in schools across Illinois. It is funded out of a substance use grant. So a lot of the questions have to do with substance use, but they have a whole host of health, social, and behavioral indicators that accompany on that survey. It is hosted through the School of Social Work at the University of Illinois. So I get to help with coordinating a lot of that. It is available to all public and private schools in Illinois who are wanting data on their students, especially around different protective and risk factors, and different behavioral indicators. The survey is completely anonymous and it is voluntary for students. And Illinois uses passive parental consent. So parents are sent home information about the survey and then they return a form if they do not want their child to participate. So this definitely helps with increasing numbers for participation across the state. So in 2018, over 230,000 youth across the state of Illinois in grades 8 through 12 participated in 98 of our 102 counties in Illinois. So a lot of great representation, a lot of mix of public and private schools. And again, when we looked at our full sample of this massive amount of students, again, we see what we would expect. About 1% identified as transgender and about 1% identified as gender expansive. However, if you're thinking of 230,000 youth, that's still a significant number of youth who have a gender minority that we were able to then pull out and be able to look at in more depth. In order to make accurate comparisons by gender identity, we used a matching analysis that allowed us to frequency match. So we had comparable samples based on grade, on their free or reduced lunch status, on race, and on geographic region. What this gave us was an analytic sample of 4,464 youth. And so we had 1,116 from each of the 4 gender identity groups. So again, this gave us a nice balanced comparison samples. But again, as we're looking at things like prevalence and these different relationships, again, we have comparable groups across gender identities. This sample resulted in descriptives listed here. Again, as we were looking across grades, counties, et cetera. Again, when we're looking at race, this was very similar to proportions in the state of Illinois. So again, we had a nice representative sample of students who are in this final analytics sample. This is a screening survey, so we were somewhat limited about the measures that were asked to capture victimization experiences with mental health experiences. So we used some screening questions on victimization in the past 12 months. So 3 items for peer victimization and 2 items for dating violence victimization. Again, getting at different dimensions of each. So having experience with physical, verbal, or cyber forms of victimization and physical and psychological forms of dating violence. Other screening assessments included depressive symptoms, questions around substance use and substance use problems, and 1 question to represent suicidal ideation. So in our first study, we dug into looking at the prevalence of victimization across these samples by gender identity. So for our analyses, we looked at the prevalence, and then we also compared to see if certain gender identities had greater odds of experiencing victimization compared to other gender identities. And all of these models were adjusted for our demographic and sociodemographic variables. So in our first study, we found overall prevalence of different forms of peer victimization. And we see in our green bar listed here, the green bar represents our trans youth. This is what they were reporting for experiences in the past year for peer victimization. We see that more than half of trans youth reported experiencing verbal peer victimization, 1 in 3 experienced cyber peer victimization, and 1 in 5 experienced physical peer victimization. The next highest group was youth who identified as gender expansive. Again, similar, the high numbers of experiences reported across the 3 forms of peer victimization. Similar trends were seen when we looked at dating violence victimization. So again, trans youth followed by gender expansive youth experienced high levels of both forms of dating violence victimization. And when we looked at our prevalence ratios across most forms when we're comparing trans and gender expansive youth to male and female identifying youth, again, we saw that significant risk as we compared across different groups. Once we established what the overall prevalence was and we're able to share these results, okay, another question that we really wanted to dig into was looking at that prevalence across grade level. Okay, so again, those previous bars included youth from 8th through 12th grade, so that average across these grades. We wanted to tease those apart and see what this prevalence looked like. So again, we did some prevalence ratios with similar regression-based models so that we could really assess, but now including that element of grade. I know there's a lot of numbers here. We love doing this as statisticians, right? Throwing numbers. So I'll just draw your attention to a couple of the numbers. So in purple, those are transgender youth from 8th grade through 12th grade. And we see that across most grades, the purple bar is the highest. So trans youth continue to experience the highest rates of forms of verbal peer victimization. Interestingly, in 9th grade, we see that gender expansive youth report the highest levels of verbal peer victimization. And you'll see this pattern across the other forms of peer victimization as well. There's something about the 9th grade year for gender expansive youth that surpasses trans youth. Something else to kind of draw your attention to is the green bar and the blue bar. Okay? For both male and female adolescents, we do kind of start to see that decline. As they go from 8th grade to 12th grade, they start to see a reduction in the experiences of verbal peer victimization. However, for trans and gender expansive youth, those numbers remain high. There's somewhat of a drop as you move towards later grades, but again, we see that significant disparity as we go across grade levels. And similar patterns are seen across our other forms of peer victimization as well. So if we're looking specifically at physical peer victimization, we see those similar kinds of patterns. But what also is really telling in this particular image is just how high these bars are in 8th and 9th grade. Even into 10th grade, it's really that transition period from 8th to 9th grade that seems to be particularly high contexts of risk for gender minority youth. And then finally, when we look at cyber victimization across grades, again, we see similar patterns. But what's interesting here is that female identifying youth also experience high rates of cyber victimization as well. So they join their trans and gender expansive youth in experiencing high rates of cyber victimization, especially in 8th and 9th grade. And then it starts to drop as we move towards 11th and 12th grade for female youth. These are always really important images that we use when talking about to school districts about when to implement violence prevention programming. Again, what grades are at highest risk? Are we too late by the time we get to 8th grade? Okay, if they're already experiencing these high rates, okay, and having conversations about ways we can embed violence prevention programming earlier so that we can try to not see these higher bars. So what these two studies showed us is that transgender youth, followed by gender expansive youth, do face significantly higher rates of peer victimization and dating violence compared to male and female youth. And that they continue to experience these high rates of victimization throughout middle school and high school. So again, thinking about the timing of programs, thinking about the timing of prevention, and the ways in which schools can play a role in this, becomes of utmost importance. The third study that we built on from these initial two studies was to understand those mechanisms of risk. Victimization is one of those mechanisms that we considered. And so again, we wanted to look at the direct and indirect effect between gender identity and suicidal ideation to understand how victimization may play a mechanism of risk, as well as other forms like depression and substance use. So we did use the same sample as the first two studies. We just built out different models to understand. Before we look at those models, though, just wanted to share some descriptive information. Again, we see similar patterns across different indicators where trans youth, followed by gender expansive youth, face substantially higher rates of these things. So 1 in 2 trans youth seriously has considered suicide in the past 12 months. When we look at depressive symptoms, trans youth are at 63.3%, and gender expansive youth are at almost 60%. Again, we see higher rates for trans and gender expansive youth when we're looking at number of substances used. And then on the substance use screener, again, we see differences. When we looked at these all in one model to really understand the direct and indirect effects, we did see that gender identity did have a direct association with suicidal ideation. So identifying as trans or gender expansive put them at a higher risk for reporting suicidal ideation in the past 12 months. But we also found that all three of our mechanisms of risk were also statistically significant. So again, some of the reasons why they may be at a higher risk for suicidal ideation is because there was a heightened risk for depressive symptoms, for victimization, and for substances, specifically if they used 3 or more substances, as well as substance use problems. So this study again found alarming rates, again with our comparable groups across gender identity. We were able to articulate and contribute to what that prevalence looks like by gender. But then we also were able to better understand these mechanisms of risk. Again, showing that all three play an important role in explaining that link between gender identity and suicidal ideation. Now that I've brought the room down, I know these first 3 studies are super sad to talk about. We're going to talk about protection now. I'm going to try to get the room upbeat now. Because again, we can talk about problems all the time, but it's trying to think about solutions. How can we change this narrative? How can we change these numbers? And so a lot of my work has been in schools. I'm a developmental psychologist by trade, and spent a lot of time in middle school classrooms for most of my career. And really thinking about the ways in which schools can play a role in preventing these things from happening is super important to me, to always make sure that we're talking about what we can strengthen, what we can support, instead of focusing just on the negative all the time. So that was the inspiration for this next piece. And we're still continuing to work with the school climate piece quite a bit. So when we're talking about school climate, it's inclusive of all of these different elements, whether it's how a student perceives their own safety within the building, how connected they feel at school, the relationships they have at school, their engagement in academics, etc. If we're looking specifically at the role that school climate can play when looking at trans and gender expansive youth, again, there's very minimal research. Some of the same issues apply with a slide I listed earlier. Again, they'll often group LGBTQ+ youth and their experiences at school together, or they'll have very small samples of trans and gender expansive youth included. And so we really wanted to unpack this more, again, using this statewide data to better understand school climate. So in the screening survey on the Illinois Youth Survey, there are 3 school climate variables that are assessed. Again, they are screening items, so a few items for each, but it does give a sense of how connected youth feel at school. It assesses their participation in school, so doing activities, engaging in class activities, and then it assesses overall caring adult relationships. So assessing relationships with teachers or other adults at the school. We looked at school climate in relation to peer victimization, depressive symptoms, and suicidal ideation, again, which were on a previous slide, again, all using these screening items. And because we were interested in the protective nature of school climate factors, we conducted moderation analyses to look at the interaction between if a youth experiences a form of victimization. They also have different experiences with school climate. How does that interaction associate with depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation among students? Because of the lack of research with trans and gender expansive adolescents, especially with large samples, we just focused on this subsample. We did not do comparative analyses at this stage, mainly because we wanted to get a better understanding of what the school context looked like before we were able to move to the comparative piece. Across our findings, all 3 forms of school climate variables did have a direct significant association with both depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation. And then when we looked at the interaction between victimization and school climate variables, we saw that there was 2 protective factors. We had high school connectedness and high caring adult relationships. So meaningful school participation was not significant as an interaction. Also, when we were looking at the interactions, they were only significant when looking at suicidal ideation as our outcome instead of depressive symptoms. An example of what one of these looks like. We have plotted here what our interaction looks like. So on our x-axis, we have no peer victimization, and to the right, we have our peer victimization. We have our suicidal ideation along our y-axis. And then we have our three forms, levels of caring adults in this example. So in the green line is our high levels of caring adults, and purple is low levels. So if we look at our purple line here, regardless if they experience no peer victimization or if they experience peer victimization, if they have perceived that there's not a lot of adults at school who care about them, okay, they're at a continued high risk for suicidal ideation. Okay, so again, the importance of having someone at school who cares about them, that they feel that they can talk to, and that is a protective factor immediately. We see that exemplified again with the green line. Okay, so again, we see lower levels of suicidal ideation for no peer victimization and at peer victimization. But again, the role of caring adults and connectedness play a significant role, especially when thinking about suicidal ideation as our outcome. So across these 4 studies, I figured it would be better to condense our discussion implications across all these studies and what we found and how they all weave together. Again, I'm hoping that these results are helpful when articulating the need for more services and supports at school settings. So again, we were able to show with large samples that trans and gender expansive adolescents are at a significantly higher risk of victimization compared to male and female identifying students. These risks remain high from 8th to 12th grades. We also looked at mechanisms of risk for suicidal ideation, specifically for gender minority youth, and these included victimization, depressive symptoms, and substance use. However, school climate factors, particularly about relationships and connectedness, are what protect youth from experiencing victimization, from also experiencing suicidal ideation. So again, really thinking about those relationships and connections within a school. So across these papers, and hopefully the 4th one will be out in publication soon, so you can read more about this one. I hope that these 4 papers are a call to action, that they're not just going to be published and out in the academic spaces, but in school and in policy spaces where we can really use this information to see change. So the first kind of call to action that I hope is prompted from this is really just articulating the critical need of violence prevention programs in our school systems. I'm not as familiar with New York school systems, but in Illinois, it is a continued fight that we need prevention programs for violence. We talk to schools that are like, oh, bullying is not a problem here. I know. I feel like I'm in a safe space to share that, right? Y'all, it's not and smile. Like, yep, heard that a million times. Okay, but again, if we have these numbers, if we have the experience of 230,000 youth that are winnowed down to our analytic sample, it's harder for them to say no to the need for this type of programming if we're able to show this. So I'm hoping that this is a call to action to state stakeholders to really fund violence prevention programs across middle and high school. And again, I know I'm talking to a similar audience in that we need to have violence prevention even earlier. Okay, again, we saw high rates in 8th grade. We need to get into the schools much sooner to really be thinking about the ways we can prevent this violence. In addition to violence prevention programming, we really also need to be targeting programs that promote mental health, work to prevent victimization and substance use. Again, in our 3rd study, we looked at those mechanisms. Again, these 3 factors increase the risk for suicidal ideation among trans and gender expansive youth. So really thinking about the ways in which we can change these mechanisms so that they're not at such high risk. And then finally, continued work around fostering more supportive, connective school climates. So many trans and gender expansive youth do not feel safe at school. They do not feel connected with their peers, with their teachers, with their staff. Many of them talk about how they don't feel cared for. They feel voiceless, that their opinion doesn't matter. And this is heard in many times when we go to focus groups with trans and gender expansive youth. They feel like they're forgotten when schools are having conversations about what would make things safer and more inclusive. And so we really need to be honing in on the ways schools can enhance their climate so that this isn't the narrative moving forward. What I don't want to have happen is for this research to really kind of flip the narrative. So what tends to happen is we see responses to mental health needs or victimization needs, which can sometimes further marginalize someone who's already marginalized. What we need to be doing is targeting the school level, the context of where this risk is existing, okay? And really be thinking about how we can change the context so that the students within that context are feeling supported and safe. So instead of focusing on addressing interpersonal mental health problems for the marginalized individual, which tends to happen a lot, it's the immediate response that schools think of doing, that's going to lead to further marginalization. It's not addressing where the actual risk is coming from. Okay, we need to move away from that and have a more shared community effort in how we address these things. And again, it will hopefully reduce the stigma and consequence problems as a result of changing those context pieces. Before I talk about some of the next steps and recommendations from this work, I just want to recognize a couple limitations, and I'm sure they might be already swimming around in your minds. Again, we are somewhat limited in our research. It was great because we were able to get these large samples, be able to get some numbers around prevalence and impact and mechanisms of risk. However, it is a statewide surveillance survey, and that comes with limitations that are worth noting. The first is that it is a cross-sectional survey. So each of these, time points that we were looking at, like 8th grade, 9th grade, those were different groups of adolescents in that particular grade. What we don't have is, what is a trans youth experience from 8th grade to 9th grade to 10th grade. So we don't have that longitudinal trajectory of what these victimization experiences look like. So again, some caution with interpreting those grade level differences and really thinking about the directionality of our mechanisms of risk model as well. We are limited by the cross-sectional nature. The second limitation is that we had a bunch of screening questions, but most of them are answered on a yes/no response scale. I experienced verbal peer victimization, I did not. Okay, it doesn't get at the severity, the frequency. It doesn't really paint us a full picture of what those victimization experiences look like. So again, future work would want to kind of flesh that out a little bit more so that we have a better understanding of what those experiences look like for you. Because this was a study funded by a substance use funder, okay, there was a ton of questions on victimization. So they just added dating violence to the survey, I think in 2017. So they're slowly adding new forms of victimization to the statewide surveillance. But we are unable at this point to assess other forms of victimization. So there's no questions currently on sexual victimization, stalking. And then what I am arguing for, and hopefully in the 2024 round of the survey, it will be included, is if you remember earlier in my talk, I mentioned that oftentimes youth who are a gender minority experience bullying directly because of their gender expression or their gender identity. And currently we do not assess that on the survey. And so I would love to include 1 or 2 questions just to see if they feel they're targeted or discriminated against because of their gender identity or expression. So I'm hoping that that will be something that we can add to the survey in the future. And then another issue, I think, with surveillance surveys, and it's always something that warrants a lot of discussion, is how we ask students to self-report gender identity. Again, we never want to label youth for them. Okay, we want to be thinking about the best ways that we can ask these questions to understand their identity and their expression. So in the state survey, like I mentioned, in 2018 was the first year they were able to add beyond the gender binary. So we added the option transgender, and then I do not identify as male, female, or transgender. So those were the 2 new responses that they added. However, still lacks nuance. We weren't able to assess if they identified as trans male, trans female. Maybe we didn't capture other youth who identified as gender fluid if they felt like that still wasn't an option listed on the survey. So again, just some issues with nuance, especially how youth identify. And similarly, because of having male, female, transgender, or I do not identify as male, female, or transgender, we were unable to assess if they were cisgender or not. So again, just some nuances with how gender was asked. And I think for the next slide, I give some recommendations of how we should be asking these questions in surveillance surveys to make sure that we are hearing and getting correct identities on these surveys. I will also say this is a huge battle with schools, how we ask gender. There's actually been about 20 or 30 schools in Illinois who have decided not to participate in the Illinois Youth Survey because we're trying to be more inclusive of how we ask gender. So if you ever want to join the fight, we're always fighting with school boards to try and make sure that we're asking the questions to students. Because again, I can't imagine opening a survey and not seeing how identify listed. I feel like it'd be incredibly isolating, and you wouldn't feel like your opinions matter to the rest of the survey. And we try to talk to principals about that importance, but we're still getting lots of pushback. Illinois is a pretty liberal state, but I think there's still issues that I think we're always going to be facing as we think about being more inclusive around gender on these types of surveys. So I can let you all know what happens at the next survey if we get some more pushback on that, but I'm hoping we keep moving in the right direction on how we ask this. So from this work, I wanted to give some recommendations to just kind of get us thinking about the ways in which we can use this research to make recommendations for schools and for prevention efforts. And the first is around how we ask about gender. Again, to address some of the limitations, this is what we posed for the next survey, how we ask sex and gender. Again, we want to tease apart sex and gender identity. So again, we have two questions. I don't know how many surveys you see where male and female are the only two sex options available on a survey, often forgetting individuals who have intersex or unknown. And then we have our list here for different gender identities. Again, we recognize this is not a perfect way to capture these different identities, but it's a start. So we had some groups of youth help us figure out how to ask these questions. So really valuable input from youth across the state who are really passionate about seeing these changes and getting involved in advocacy work helped us with writing these different options. It felt really important to a lot of the youth, and again, I'm hoping this moves forward, is actually giving a blank too if youth identify as a gender that's not listed to make sure they feel they can fill it in. I know often these are given on Scantrons or are on different survey platforms that don't always allow for write-in answers, but we really felt that was a movement that Illinois needed to make. Recommendation 2 is all about the ways in which schools can play a role in this work. There is a difference between a school having a policy and a school implementing a policy well. So I have some examples in Illinois, just because that's where I live and that's where all these students are from. So I tried to do some work in looking into New York, so you can let me know if I'm completely mistaken on certain things in New York. But some movement's been happening a lot in Illinois schools between, how do we make this connect between a policy and then actually implementing that policy? So in Illinois, we do have pretty lengthy description in our bullying policies that specifically articulate protections for LGBTQ+ students. What we're trying to investigate now is to dig into that and actually see if schools are doing that. So do students actually feel that if a case comes forward, that they were protected, that they were treated fairly? So we're doing some work with kind of that policy implementation piece to make sure that they are in fact being protected by these laws and policies in Illinois. One of the ways is that Illinois schools are required to send their policy around bullying every year to the state. Last I talked to the state, they lost the email password for that account. There was no way to hold the state accountable for these policies. I hope it's not just Illinois. So embarrassing. We're working through it. They're hopefully going to be able to unlock that account so that we can actually assess these policies. Because again, it's great if we have a policy, but our schools actually enforcing them is a whole different story. But again, as we're thinking about this research and the ways in which it can be embedded, talking to schools about the ways in which they assess and monitor school climate. Okay, so how are they addressing violence prevention? How are they putting protections in place for transgender expansive youth? And again, making sure that we're continuing to check with schools to make sure that they are upholding these policies. Some of the things that have been really helpful in conversations with schools about ways that they can support trans and gender expansive youth is using correct gender pronouns. Okay, it's a quick thing you can add to introductions, and it can help make students feel connected and included. Making sure that teachers and staff are not dead naming students, so they're using their chosen name. That schools offer gender neutral bathrooms. And that they get rid of clothing requirements that force an adolescent to wear clothing that's incongruent with how they identify or choose to express themselves. There's a push within schools to have more training opportunities so that their staff and teachers are given more anti-transphobic education. And again, continuing to talk to schools about not only increasing the number of violence prevention programs, but also making sure that those programs are inclusive of different gender identities. So using programs that not just you give examples of male and female identifying students. So again, trans and gender expansive students feel like they're included in these conversations around ways to prevent violence. I know these slides will be shared after, so I just have some resources if any of you are interested in kind of reading more on this landscape and the ways in which bullying prevention is really trying to think through the role of LGBTQ youth being an amplified voice in these programs. So in 2019, a review came out that looked at the ways in which schools can embed these different policies and practices and the ways in which they can support students and find positive outcomes. So they did find that a lot of those elements I just described have a significant effect, but the issue is there's not a lot of long-term research on this yet. So again, making sure we're following up with students a year or two after these policies have been implemented. So this is a start and a great way to show evidence that these practices are going to be supportive and helpful to our students. An area that I think needs a ton more evidence, and I'm excited my postdoc is working a lot on this area, is cyber victimization. And we all know high school is different now than when we went, right? They're having to navigate lots of contexts where risk can happen, and really thinking about the ways in which our schools are providing cyberbullying prevention programs. When I looked at this 2019 review, which looked at the role of cyberbullying interventions, very few of them were actually just focusing on cyberbullying. They were larger bullying prevention that had like a lesson on social media or a lesson on kind of how to use the internet. But I'm sorry, those kids are going to know more about that than the person who's implementing it, right? So again, we really think about how we're teaching internet safety and how students are interacting in online spaces. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. And I think we need to start listening to our youth and the experiences they're having in these cyber spaces. So as we're developing these programs, and as we're thinking about inclusivity around gender, that we maybe think about different ways we can move forward with cyber victimization prevention and really carve that out. Again, we saw such a high risk across gender. Again, we saw specifically high rates for female, trans, and gender expansive youth. And so we need more of this in our schools than just one lesson on how to use the internet. And then I think the other thing is just the importance of school and staff trainings. I didn't find a ton of research on, evaluation of these trainings, what's helpful, what's not. I think it's an area that, we really benefit from learning more about, is thinking about, what is helpful for teachers? What do teachers want to know? Every time we've gone and talked to teachers and school staff about these issues and different identities, they have a million questions for us. They want to engage in this. They want to understand where their students are coming from. And I think we need to really be thinking about the ways in which we're teaching this and evaluating what we're teaching, and just thinking of that inclusion in future efforts. One area that has gotten a lot of research in the last couple of years is the importance of gender and sexuality alliances, or GSAs, at school. A lot of the initial research is finding that this is helping create more connected and caring school climates. These can be, great peer youth-led groups that are really engaging in educational dialogue. keep thinking of the roles that they can play in actually facilitating teacher trainings and community trainings and parent trainings. So that, again, youth have that active role in what we're trying to teach them about gender and sexuality. And so again, making sure we're all connected in ways to enhance school climate. And then my final recommendation, again, is at the state level. So again, making sure that as we're in this space, as we're trying to advocate for changes at the school level, we're also thinking about things that are happening at the state level. So this is where staying informed about the laws that are continually changing about our gender minoritized youth. So I pulled a couple because I was like, ooh, what's happening in New York? These are some of the things I found, and this website here was great. It gave a lot of different examples of the, I think this was just passed in June of this year. So just some good resources I found around the ways in which New York's schools are supporting trans and gender expansive students. Illinois does not have this pretty of a document. So I was like, ooh, I might have to borrow this and share. So again, a really great resource here to be thinking about ways in which the state can play a role. The importance of task forces that include youth. Again, so many times I go to state meetings and it's the same people talking at each other. And they're not hearing from different voices and pulling in youth perspectives. Even those decisions that we're making are about the youth. And so again, making sure that these task forces include gender support coordinators, teacher trainings, and have youth involved. Continuing to take needs assessments around the different things and supports that trans gender expansive students need, not just in the schools, but in their communities as well. So continuing to build out statewide needs assessments. A couple of years ago now, before COVID, I feel like COVID kind of ruined all my dates in my mind. The inclusion curriculum law in Illinois passed, which mandates that public schools include lessons on the contributions of LGBTQ+ people within the school systems. So again, that was an exciting pass that happened in Illinois. Again, just ways in which the state can help play a role in making sure that we are seeing some changes and supports for LGBTQ+ folk. And then continuing to review programs, interventions, critiquing those, thinking about the ways in which they apply and adapt to different settings. Especially, Illinois is, I think, very similar to New York in that there's a very large city, then there's the rest of the state, right? And so thinking about the ways in which these programs translate in rural spaces, in small towns, not just in Chicago, not just in New York City. So really thinking about the ways in which they adapt and making sure that state officials remember that there's a rest of the state. So this has really spurred a lot of kind of the current work that I'm doing. Just to give you some snapshots. And again, I'd be happy to talk to anyone more about this work. Couple things that we have planned. We have one more study planned with the statewide data to really understand intersections of gender identity by other identities. So with race, with geographic location, with socioeconomic status indicators, to really understand if they have multiple intersecting minority identities, what that experience amplifies of risk for victimization. I mentioned we're reviewing bullying policies, again, making sure they are inclusive of gender minoritized populations and that they're actually implementing those policies as they said. And then I like going to state meetings and shaking things up a bit. Okay, so again, I try my best to share this research in all kinds of state spaces to make sure that they are included in violence prevention planning efforts. We are just starting our next 5-year planning at the state, and we're going to try really hard to get some youth groups started so that they can be actively writing these goals with state legislators. So I'm excited to see where this goes and make sure we keep amplifying their work. Just some other resources if you want them. Again, because I'm in this policy space right now of meeting with state, a lot of these have recommendations of ways that schools can interact with policy. And other resources that are particularly helpful as navigating this topic. And then I do just want to dedicate all this work to the trans and gender expansive youth who shared their experiences with us on the Illinois Youth Survey. It's incredibly vulnerable to share these experiences, and I just want to thank them for participating in this, to let us try to understand what's going on with them so that we can try to work with them to have better supports and services. And finally, before I jump to questions, just thank you again to the center for hosting me, for having me out here. I really enjoyed reading your publications and seeing the work that you all are doing. And I look forward to continuing to connect with you in the future.
Thank you so much. I'm not the mic is over here. I'm gonna come over here. So we have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A discussion. Those of you on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions either in the chat or the Q&A.
Because there's always that awkward pause.
It's always an awkward
It's like I knew there was that awkward. It's shameless plug for QR code for our lab webpage. If you want to stay updated on publications and research that comes out of our lab, as well as the statewide plan, you can find it at this QR code. Yeah.
I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you. That was really a great presentation and I learned a lot and love the work that you're doing. I really appreciate the way that you thought about and asked others about how to ask about gender identity. And I'm wondering, I guess that's more sort of advice for those of us that don't have samples of 5,000 youth, because we've gotten in the position and we haven't asked right. We're still learning, but oftentimes for our analyses, we have actually they're a growing number, but such small numbers that are saying transgender or are saying, and ours they've said like prefer not to answer. So I am wondering if we should be asking that different because it's hard to know. Are they saying none of your business or are they saying that you're gender expansive? So I guess, is there any way either statistically or conceptually that you would recommend those of us that may be getting more like 400 people on a survey to be able to look more closely at things? Or is it just one of those things where you really need a larger sample or honing in on that population specifically?
Yeah, unfortunately, power analyses.
Yeah, I know.
We just don't have the power we need to. I know a school study right now, and there's 300 kids, and I think 10 of them identify as a gender minority, and so we have to think about do we report that small group? And then there's also concerns of everyone know who those 10 students are, so you don't want to also share out that information to protect their rights. So we're constantly grappling with the same things. I would say when trying to do kind of large scale prevalence and things like that, I feel like the larger samples are necessary to really paint that picture. But I do think the way we ask may get more power to those groups, because again, maybe there are youth who are like staring at the page like, I don't see my identity listed here, and so maybe they're just checking female because they're like, I guess that's the closest to, so I think we're going to get more accurate identification as we think about how we ask that question to students. It's a hard question. Yeah, I know. Things that keep me up at night too. Yeah.
Well, I think that's an argument for possibly mixed methods to then leave the opportunity for people to say they'd be willing to be interviewed or engage and to get some additional data that you can't get because of the numbers. In race-related research, there's a book that was written on higher education on the lack of how in almost every sample nobody includes Indigenous people, right? And so I have a friend from Syracuse who wrote a book called Beyond the Asterisk. And that's sort of where I see transgender and gender expansive youth as being in a similar sort of space and place, and that there's never enough numbers. And so I think rather than, alternatives aren't great, whether it is that you kind of throw out that data and don't represent those individuals, or you underpowered, but design is the only other way. And I think doing some of the work you're doing, which is focusing in specifically with large data sets or somehow to target specifically those populations for studies. There's a bunch of people doing this research, not necessarily in the schools. So we just have to keep challenging the way that we do research.
Be able to adapt to all those changes that are constantly coming up that we're hearing from. Yeah. it reminded me, we're also doing a study right now that is using more of a mixed methods approach. So we're doing life history calendars with trans women specifically, to kind of tease apart one of the things I mentioned, which is that you could ask someone, did you experience victimization? But yes or no really doesn't give you that context piece. So we're trying to understand victimization histories across the lifespan for trans women. We're asking questions around bullying, around dating violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, community violence, ACEs, to try and really understand this landscape through life history calendars. We are having a small sample, I think it's 40 trans women who are included, but that method's allowing us to really better understand those contexts as well.
I'm gonna jump in with a shameless plug for Jennifer Livingston and myself, Amy Heckenberg. The NIH is actually increasingly interested in this assessment piece, and particularly how well this two-step gender, gender assigned at birth, current gender identity, how well that's working across diverse populations. And we are conducting a study with LGBTQ+ youth and just received an administrative supplement that we're going to target trans and gender expansive youth to conduct mixed methods, but really with an emphasis on the qualitative component, and interviewing them and talking to them about, like, what do you think about these sort of the cognitive interviewing strategies? And our goal is to, like, because it's a longitudinal study, is to do more than one interview over time, because we're thinking about all the fluidity that youth experience in terms of their sexual identity, their gender identity, etc. And like, how does that all sort of lead into their perception of these assessments? And so we're really excited about that. I mean, we literally just found out, and so we have congratulations. Yeah. So it's pretty exciting. So
I'd love to stay connected with you. I would love to hear what you learn and you find in your research.
Yes, we would love to pass our like qualitative interview, like get your ideas about, what should we be asking you?
Well, then we can look at youth in Illinois and New York and make those, it'd be so fun. Yeah, I'd love to stay connected.
Yeah, I wrote down on your contact info, so.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm gonna look at.
Glad you have your shameless plug. I mean, that's so exciting that you're doing that.
Related to that, I thought it was interesting because you have those new categories that you got feedback from you, which sort of contradicts what APA is saying now with APA style, right? Which is male and female should not be nouns. They are a biological, not a gender. They shouldn't be. And so they say use male and female as adjectives. So a male youth is fine, but to just say you are a male shouldn't be that way. But it's this came out in the most recent APA style guide, and so it's kind of where people are. It's going to be changing, and we can't. It's hard to keep up.
It is. I feel like so. I think talked to you. This was just in 2021, so it's about 2 years ago. And we had the updates always with the IRB and everything. It takes, you have to develop, and then by the time everything gets approved and implemented, new stuff comes out, and we're like, oh. And now I'm curious what we're going to keep learning about how to ask these things and try to stay up on it. Yeah.
I have some colleagues that ask traditional, do you identify as a man, a woman, transgender, and all this, but then they always also collect open-ended data that says, how do you want, if the terms that you identified yourself are not in that list, tell us what terms you use. But the way I think about it is, you either give them the categories and have them choose, or you're going to have to categorize them after the fact, which takes away their agency, their vote. I think it's because I sometimes would argue, well, just keep it open and then do it afterwards. And I'm like, I don't know, that kind of takes away their voice too.
Would they group themselves the same way you're grouping them? And it's a lot of questions to grapple with. Yeah. The tough measurement stuff. So really excited to hear what you two come up with. So
I was interested to see you talking about the GSAs in your recommendations, because I was thinking about that it's sort of implicit in your school climate, but I was thinking that's a really powerful tool and potentially powerful way to support youth and build a good supportive adults in the school climate. And there are a lot of great community organizations doing work in this area. And but we just don't know enough about, nobody's like measuring how effective this is programming and so
We're
yeah.
taking randomized control trials either of like, because the schools that are creating the GSAs are usually on the path towards, trying to have more inclusive policies. So it'd be interesting if there was ever a randomized trial where we could assess fully the impact of GSAs. There was a school district in Illinois, really close to our campus, had some really horrific, bullying experiences happen last year to a trans youth. And their community voted against having a GSA, even though they were like low-hanging fruit, like it's, we have a small group, that way at least they know kind of who their community is, we have teachers that are supporting it. So even with that, that research that, information about the importance of GSAs, there's still schools that are just like, nope, not doing it. And it's just so disheartening to see that. Yeah, I'm excited to see where the GSA the research results though, because I think it could open some more doors if we learn more about them.
Well, it's really challenging too, because Amanda had one of the local organizations focused on gay and lesbian youth, Service at Bliss, come in and do a talk for targeting teachers. And they expressed a lot of challenges related to hearing from youth, and their school supports them in supporting youth to use their chosen gender pronouns, etc. But then parents swooping in and saying, no, you are not going to do that and support my youth in that way. And teachers are really stuck in this horrible spot. And there's like the laws and the policies don't really address that. And it was interesting because our local organization, I don't think they have like answers. There's no good answer. And so it's really tough. And I don't know. So complicated.
And it's easier here than in many other states.
Yeah, exactly.
New York is one of the lucky ones,
Right.
It's still in Illinois too. It's still happening, but not at the degree and not at the vitriol as it is in other states.
I feel like just horrific thinking about like what's happening in Florida and other states where trans youth are literally being erased from so much in those school systems. Yeah, so although Illinois lost their email password to the college, there's still good things happening in Illinois, but yeah, a lot of work to be done.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful